Hi guys, this is the last unit of AP Biology, so get excited, we're almost done. In this unit, we're going to be looking at ecology and how our environment and the biotic and abiotic factors interact with each other around us. So get ready, and we are starting. All right, so ecology. This is just the scientific study of how there are interactions between like the species and organisms within an ecosystem and the abiotic or the non-living surroundings and just everything that goes on, every relationship between these species and the environment. That's what ecology is. Oh, sorry. So basically, we're just looking at the environment. So biotic factors we were talking about just a second ago, those are living factors within an ecosystem. Abiotic, these are non-living factors. So yeah, those are pretty easy terms. You should probably remember that from your freshman biology class. All right. So some of these terms are going to be really easy, so I'm going to kind of breeze through them. Like producers, you should know what producers are from the photosynthesis chapter. And producers are just organisms that convert solar energy into food. They can also be chemiosynthetic, which means they derive energy from like just or chemical compounds. But basically, they're just producers. They're plants. Consumers, these are heterotrophs. These are organisms that use other organisms for food. And you can see there's herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. You should know those terms as well. But basically, we're going to be looking at these pyramids just a little bit and understanding that the producers or plants are at the bottom, and then herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores are closer to the top. And we can see here these definitions. We have plants; these are your producers. Then we have the herbivores that only eat plants, omnivores that eat the plants and the herbivores, and then the carnivores that eat just the omnivores and herbivores. Another example here, another word that you should know is decomposer. These are organisms that break down dead or organic matter. So anything that's decaying, anything that's died, we're going to break that down using decomposers. All right. Within ecology, we also have this organization of life. And you can see here an organism is just one single living thing. That's a term you should know. A population, all the organisms in a species in a particular environment. So you can see we're going from an individual to a population. Again, these are terms you probably could have guessed on your own, but we're going to just review them here quickly. A community is a group of interacting populations that occupy the same area at the same time. So you can see here all of these different populations of different species. That's a community. Ecosystem, this is adding in all the abiotic factors. So you can see here now we're adding in rocks, water, air, anything that's abiotic. And then we have we technically we're going to breeze over biomes. Biomes are but we have like set characteristics of biomes. We really don't cover them in that much detail in this class, but we should remember those from 9th and 10th grade biology. Like you have your temperate rainforest, or you have your rainforest, you have your dry rainforest, you have your temperate forest, you have your deciduous forest, you have your coniferous forest, tundra, things like this. They have specific types of biomes that are unique to certain areas based on climate and precipitation. And then all those ecosystems working as a whole is the biome, is a biosphere. All right, food chains. These are, it shows you the movement of energy. So you can see here the crayfish eats all the plants and seeds and fruits and algae. And then you can see the crayfish is eaten by the frog, and the frog is eaten by the alligator. So in this case here, we have this transfer of energy from the plants all the way up to the alligator. So remember, though, that the arrows are pointing to where the energy goes. Okay, a food web is all of those different food chains put together, and you can see how interconnected everything here is. And you can see how the original food chain is still there, but this is just a little bit bigger. It's a food web. So we have here plants being eaten by deer, which are being eaten by a bobcat, or these plants are eaten by a raccoon, which is eaten by the alligator. These plants are eaten by grass shrimp, which is eaten by the killfish, the largemouth bass, and then this bird, I can't pronounce the name. But all of these then, when they die, are broken down by decomposers or scavengers. All right, so more terms about this energy flow, but primary producers, these are just your autotrophs, and they support all the other organisms in the ecosystem. And these are just like the plants, algae, and photosynthetic organisms just in general. Primary consumers, these are your heterotrophs or your herbivores. They eat the autotrophs. Secondary, tertiary consumers, they are also heterotrophs, but they are carnivores usually, or omnivores, and they eat the herbivores. And then you can go even to the quaternary or the 5th level, 6th level, depending on your ecosystem and the food web. And then these decomposers, again, they break that energy back down into organic material that we're going to recycle in the carbon cycle. Within energy flow, we have this thing called the 10% rule, which means that only 10% of the energy is going to be absorbed in the next level. That's because of heat. So a lot of the energy that is going to be used up by an organism is going to be lost in the form of heat. To give you an example, if there is a million joules of sunlight, then we're going to have only about 10,000 joules that are going to be captured by the primary producers. Only 10% of that's going to make it to the consumers. So even though that these are going to eat the primary producers, they're only going to gain about 10% of that energy. And then from there, we're only going to get about 100 joules of energy to these carnivores, and then the last step here, the snake here, is only going to get 10% of that. So you can see how we need a lot of plants and only a few tertiary consumers for an ecosystem. And I'm just going to remind you that 90% is usually lost as heat. This leads us to understand what biomass is. You can see biomass is total dry mass of all the organisms in a given area. This decreases as we go up the food chain. So you can see here, plants are a majority of that biomass, and bacteria are as well. And you can see animals are a very small portion of this biomass, just because if we had a lot of these, we'd need a lot more plants. So it just wouldn't work having these be balanced. We have to have animals being very small in the biomass percentage wise versus plants. I mean, if you think about it, just look out in the woods or around you. There are tons and tons and tons and tons of plants and only a few organisms per plant. So you can see here we only account for a small portion of the biomass of our ecosystems. This shows you the like the biomass of or the primary production of just like earth and organic matter throughout the year. And you can see as it goes through the months here, it's following the sun. So the sun really helps us with this gross primary production. Okay, it's kind of a weird graph to look at, but all right, endotherms and ectotherms. Endotherms are organisms that use the thermal energy produced by your metabolism. We are endotherms. We get our energy from our metabolism. However, ectotherms don't. They have to regulate their internal temperatures by the sun or movement or other things. You can see here, as the environmental temperature goes up, ectotherms temperature will also go up. Here, we don't need that sun. Our heat comes from our metabolism, and so we don't need the sun, and it's there. I don't want to say we don't need the sun because we need the sun, but we don't need the sun the same way that the ectotherms do. One thing I want you to understand, though, this is a non-binary scale, so don't think this is like you're either an endotherm or ectotherm. We have things called mesotherms that are in the middle between endotherms and ectotherms, and they think dinosaurs were actually mesothermic. So some of them were on maybe the warmer side, closer to endotherms. Some were more on the ectothermic side. So this is a scale. It's not a binary system. You can see here that there are organisms that are living today that are mesothermic, which are in the middle between the two. All right, biodiversity. This is the amount of variation of a species within an ecosystem. You can see here ecosystems with higher biodiversity have more biomass, and they're usually stronger. So biodiversity is a good thing for a environment. So you can see here the biodiversity, a high biodiversity, medium, and then lower, we have less and less species or more and more species for those higher diversities. So this is a biodiversity map, and basically what this is showing you is there's a lot of biodiversity around the equator, and that kind of makes sense because the more sun you have, the higher amounts of biodiversity you're going to have. Towards the north and south north and south poles, you're going to have less and less of biodiversity. Just there's just not that much light, there's not much energy for organisms, so you're not going to have a very diverse set of organisms there. But we can see that along the equator here, we have the highest amounts of biodiversity. All right, the role of an organism is known as the ecological niche. I've heard it both ways, niche or niche. I usually say niche, but basically this includes all of the aspects of that organism, such like what it eats, what eats it, where it lives, how it reproduces, what energy does it use, what role in a energy cycling or chemical cycling, and just the relationship it has with other species. This is just the role an organism has within the environment. And usually if you take that species out, some other roles change, and that's because every species is interconnected with other species in some way. So this is just the role an organism plays within the environment. The image here, I've yet to find a really good image for this slide, just because like this is showing you like kind of like almost niche partitioning, but or niches of these different species. So like these species live up here, these species live here, these species live here. So they each have a different role within their habitats here. But there is a lot more than just where your habitat is for a niche. So I love using this as an example, though. The niche empty feet, so like it's like the But what this is essentially saying is there were no organisms living on land, and then Tiktaalik again evolved. Not that saying it wanted to evolve, but it evolved the arm-like appendage to kind of walk on land and to kind of move from water to land because no one was filling that niche of a land-dwelling vertebrate. So it kind of filled that niche very early on in the like to about 375 million years ago in the Devonian era. And so what we see is when extinctions occur, certain other species fill niches that are left open by the extinct species. These are just the rules they play in the environment. If you think about the dinosaurs, they had like the T-Rex, they had a specific role to be a predator in that environment. When they went away, other species took that role. And so we had these larger predator species that took the role of the T-Rex. We're going to look at population dynamics now, and basically this first graph is going to show us survivorship curves, or how much of a species survives throughout the lifetime of that species. So type 1 curve, this is when organisms at a very young age and even middle age don't have a lot of death occurring. So like 99% of babies born are going to make it through and make it to reproduction age. And then there's a high amount of death later on in life. And humans are a perfect example of this curve. Now, this curve has changed throughout the years because of medical technology, but basically we have low amounts of death in the beginning and higher amounts of death at the end. In type 2, you have this constant death rate where it's going to be equal death throughout the lifetime of that organism, throughout its lifetime. Type 3, this is when you have high amounts of death rate in the beginning, and then you have lower amounts in constant throughout the rest of the life here. So if you imagine all the seeds coming out of like a tree, not all the seeds are going to make it to adulthood. So a lot of those seeds are going to die out. And you can imagine each one of these seeds is like a new organism. You're going to have high amounts of death here and low amounts of death then further on. So out of a tree, if we have how many of these seeds are produced every year, maybe only one or two of them are going to produce an actual tree that grows up into adulthood. So this is a type 3 curve. Within population dynamics, we also have population distribution, and it's pretty, self-explanatory. Again, I think I could have gave you guys these words beforehand, and you would have got them. But basically, clumped is the the most common, and you have and they're clumped around resources. Usually, you can see there they are clumped. Uniform, they're usually are spaced out, and there's no kind of orientation for them, so they're just spaced out and they're uniform. And then random, this is where they're really unpredictable, and you could have maybe small patches of clumping and others more uniform. They're just everywhere. This isn't common in nature just because of competition and interactions between other species, but it is still there. All right, we have a couple different factors here that we talk about with the populations. Density dependent factors, and it sounds like what it does. They're dependent on the density. So like resources limitation. So like how big a population is or how dense a population is, resources are going to greatly affect those density dependent factors. You can see here food, shelter, space, predation, infectious diseases. So the more organisms are in or should I say the higher density of a population of organisms, the more food they're going to need, the more shelter they're going to need, the more space. The predation is going to be a factor there. So these are dependent on the density of those species. The other is density independent factors, and these are independent of the population or size. So like earthquakes, it doesn't matter if we're living in Bellefonte or New York City, an earthquake's going to affect that population. Storms, it doesn't matter if we have 10,000 people in a town and a hurricane goes through, or 100,000 people, they're all going to be affected. Volcanic activity, things that are like natural disasters, are examples of density independent factors. We're going to talk about exponential growth and logistic growth here, but basically we've probably seen this in your math classes, but exponential growth is when there are ideal conditions, population grows very quickly, and you can see here it goes exponentially or towards the sky almost, and you're just increasing very rapidly. This occurs very rarely in nature, and this is what I should say there is and it keeps on occurring because there has to be some type of limiting factor we're going to learn about next. A population can't just keep on growing and growing and growing. We're going through this right now with humans. We have rapidly increased our population in the past couple hundred years, but there has to be a limit. You can't just keep on and having more and more humans. There's going to be some limiting factor that we're going to talk about next, just like we talked about. You can see that population graph. Wow, it go up really quickly here. I remember back in high school when we were going to reach 6 billion. That was like a huge, like, oh my gosh, it reached 6 billion. And now we're getting close to 8 billion. So like I said, the unlimited resources are rare. unlimited resources are rare, so you have these limiting factors. So, like for humans, how much food there is, how much space there is on Earth, just these factors that are going to limit a population's increase. And what we say when it reaches that increases, it reaches its carrying capacity, and this is the maximum population a like an ecosystem can hold. So this will level out at some time.
All right. So logistic growth is when the population increase starts to slow down due to the limiting factors, and when it gets closer to the carrying capacity. And this is an S-shaped curve, right? Here you can see that S. I forgot to mention, I'm going to go back here really quickly. This is a J-shaped curve. So you can see here when somebody's talking about a J-shaped curve in a population like study, they're talking about exponential growth. And we're looking at the S-shaped curve, that's logistic growth there. Now we have two different types of species. Our selected species are ones that reproduce very quickly and can go through a very rapid increase in population. These are like plants and insects. Their offspring are usually small. They mate fast and they require little care, and their reproduction time is very quick, or is very quick. And the K-selected species are populations that take a longer time to reach the carrying capacity. Humans are an example of this. It just takes us longer to reproduce. When you think of this, think of K, which is for K for carrying capacity, which is not what that starts with, but think K-selected carrying capacity. That will help.
All right, so the next portion of ecology is going to be looking at responses to the environment. And this is kind of out of the animal behavior chapter, but basically we're going to go over taxis and kinesis. Taxis is a change in direction, automatic movement towards the positive taxis or the positive stimulus and away from negative stimulus. You can see the direction of the river. The fish are going to use that positive stimulus to move up that stream. If they're going in the opposite direction, they're going to, like if they're going with direction, that's going to be a negative taxis or a negative stimulus, and they're going to start going in the opposite direction. So this is just how an organism kind of finds its way throughout the world, using positive and negative stimuluses. Kinesis, this is just random movement. So you can see this little pill bug, and he just randomly moves, and he's going to change the rate of the movement based on the stimulus. So if he likes an area, he's going to slow down. If he doesn't like an area, he's going to quicken up, and then maybe he likes this area, so he slows down until he finds an area, and maybe he might stay there for a while. So this is kinesis. So taxis is more directional. Kinesis is more just random. You can see here, taxis is right towards the spot, and then kinesis is kind of random, and it will eventually find its way there and then slow down and maybe even stop. All right, so the organisms we've been talking about, they have a lot of ways to communicate, and I'm just going to go over a couple here because you should see a lot of these in just everyday life. Basically, animals use a variety of auditory, tactile, chemical, or visual signals. So, like auditory, like bird calls, mating calls, anything where you're listening and using your hearing. Tactile, this is feeling. So, like anything where an organism has to feel for another type of signal. Chemical could be pheromones, could be smelling something that's around. So using those signals as a ways of communicating, and also visual ones. That's the one everyone kind of easily gets, is like visual ones. You see a snake with different colors, and you're like, ooh, I don't know, I want to go close to that snake because it's communicating something to me. Some communications can indicate dominance. So like, hey, this is my area. Don't come near me. You could talk about your territory. This is my area. Communicate about food, saying, hey, there's food over here, or maybe that there's a predator over there. Please beware. You're part of my group, so don't go over that location. Or advertise for a mate. We've talked about that with sexual selection. Pheromones, you can see the mosquito here actually uses or can sense CO2 levels, and that's how it can find humans. The cheetahs here are marking their territory by using urine, and then you can see here the male here is interested in the female because of the pheromones that the female is giving off. So within community ecology, we have something called kin selection, and this is basically when an organism kind of risks themselves to save their family members. So you can see this meerkat is looking out for a predator, and then when it sees it, it's going to call out to its friends, not friends, I'm sorry, its family, and say, "Hey, there's a predator around. Go hide and save yourselves." Now, if you think within natural selection, like this shouldn't happen because this lowers the fitness of that meerkat that's calling out, because that predator now knows where that meerkat is. But what you have to now think of is not just organisms like and their adaptations, it's now group selection and how groups of organisms can be selected for. So if there is a gene that makes this organism do this and call it and protect the people around, or the organisms in its family around it, that's going to be a beneficial gene to have evolutionarily, because now the other ones are going to be protected. So there is a lot of data and there's a lot of studies behind kin selection and altruistic behaviors, because of group selection, and it's a very interesting concept and a model to kind of or go into. Richard Dawkins has a lot of writing on about this in his books. So if you're interested in that, look up some Richard Dawkins books about kin selection. All right, within community ecology, we have species interacting with each other, and these interactions either are positive, negative, or neutral. And we're going to be talking about those symbiotic relationships, or those interactions between two or more species. So competition, this is when two organisms or two species compete with each other for a reproductive advantage, or just some advantage overall. You can see here the two organisms competing with each other. And basically it's a negative negative in this instance, because they're both using energy and competing with each other and risking something in the long term. So it's actually a negative negative in this case. Predation, and you can see this worm just eating that fly. Man, he's hungry. But basically, this is when a predator or an organism eats and kills another organism, and it's pretty basic. You guys should probably know this one. All right, so preys have defense, and you can see warning colors that's saying, hey, I'm not a person to mess with, so don't mess with me. That frog I would not eat. Or you can camouflage. You can see this butterfly here. It camouflages very well in its environment. Batesian mimicry. These are harmless, and this mimics the actual harmful. So we have this eastern coral snake, which is venomous. The scarlet king snake actually matches or not matches perfectly, but it somewhat does, the venomous snake, even though it's not venomous. So it's saying, hey, I might be venomous, but it's really not. Malarian mimicry. This is when species evolve to look harmful, but they're actually not. So you can see these beetles. I'm sorry, these down here are not actually dangerous, but they have signs of looking dangerous, because um, they appear to be dangerous. They're not. All right, some more interactions that we have, so parasitism or parasite. These are when parasites eat the nourishment off a host, or they eat part of a host. Obviously, one's going to benefit and one's going to be negatively affected. Mutualism is when there are both species benefit. It's a positive positive, and then commensalism. This is when one species benefits and the other is not affected or has very little effect. Species. This is a species that is very important to a community. So you can see this otter, even though it's a tertiary or a top level consumer, it's very important to have that otter in this environment, because without it, these sea urchins would overgrow and bloom in their population. And you can see here the overgrazed kelp. So these otters keep this species in check, which makes the ecosystem work very efficiently. If there is no sea otter and that keystone species is absent, you can see a keystone, like the keystone in Pennsylvania, the whole ecosystem is going to be greatly affected. So keystone species, yeah, they're the real MVPs here. Invasive species. These are species that are non-native to a habitat, and they drastically change the food chain or ecosystem. So when there is a healthy ecosystem, you have a invasive species come in that's not usually there. And since it doesn't usually have predators, or it just is not, the ecosystem is not used to that invasive species, there are major problems. The U.S. spends billions of dollars on trying to control invasive species every single year.